Recovery to Leading the Fight for Incarcerated Women by Susan Burton and Cari Lynn. I'm Emma, one of the book club program specialists coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. We invite you to let us know where you're from in the YouTube comments. And if you have trouble commenting, make sure that you are subscribed to the Trauma Research Foundation YouTube channel. As you settle in, I'd like to tell you about the Trauma Research Foundation and outline a little of what you can expect from today's event. So TRF is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to bringing together a community of clinicians, researchers, and educators to support finding and implementing approaches to help heal those whose lives are affected by trauma. Our book club is currently in its second year, and it's been a wonderful experience so far. Our growing team has been continually learning how to create the best experience for both panelists and our streaming audience. In this series, we have two moderators to facilitate this discussion, Atra Tarfa and Dr. Keisha Sirabois. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge that time, attention, and care. I'm excited to introduce the TRF team that makes this production possible. Pat, our media manager, Connor, our media specialist, myself, and my colleague, an amazing partner in this program, Liz. Each of us are program specialists. So today's session is the third episode of this four-part series. Each week brings together as many 10 panelists to discuss Becoming Miss Burton by Susan Burton and Cari Lynn. And next week will be our special final episode on Thursday, June 29th, when Susan Burton herself will join our conversation for a live Q&A session, and I promise you won't want to miss it. So we invite our virtual community to participate in the discussion. Feel free to use the YouTube chat function to share your comments throughout the session. Our team at TRF are all tuning in with you, and we'll be sharing some comments after each discussion question. If you have trouble commenting, again, make sure that you are subscribed to the Trauma Research Foundation YouTube channel. And please note that this discussion is not a substitute for, nor does it replace professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have any concerns or questions about your health, you should always consult with a physician or other healthcare professional in the mental health field. We'll be sharing information about each of our incredible panelists as they respond to their first question. Panelists are invited to apply from anywhere in the world and from every background. We truly welcome voices representing a diversity of experiences and thoughts. So to help ground us in this conversation, we're happy to offer a study guide as a companion to your reading. Please download the study guide from the link in the chat that Liz is providing you. And now I'm so excited to introduce our book club moderators, Atra Tarfa and Dr. Keisha Sirabois. Our first moderator, Atra Tarfa, is a highly skilled and dedicated certified trauma recovery coach supervisory level recognized by the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaches. As an instructor with her extensive knowledge, empathetic nature, and personal experience, Atra provides invaluable support to trauma survivors as they navigate their healing journeys. Drawing from her own experiences as a trauma survivor, she founded compassionate coaching for complex trauma to help individuals reclaim their lives and thrive beyond trauma. As a board member of PATH, a program that addresses addiction and underlying trauma using an internal family systems-informed approach, Atra demonstrates her commitment to holistic recovery. She actively contributes to the program's mission of providing comprehensive support to individuals, recognizing the interconnectedness of addiction and trauma. Currently serving an 8-year term as a locally elected district supervisor, Atra brings a self-led, trauma-responsive voice to local policy, ensuring the needs of families in her community are heard and represented. Through her role, she advocates for the needs of trauma survivors and actively works toward creating a supportive and inclusive environment for all. Thank you so much for being here, Atra. Our second moderator is Dr. Keisha Sirabois. Dr. Keisha is the CEO of Dr. Keisha Cares Consulting and Coaching and specializes in public speaking, diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and trauma-informed mindset coaching. With a passion for racial literacy education and leadership development, she brings a wealth of knowledge, experience, and global perspective to the table. Dr. Keisha's accomplishments have made her a prominent figure in the realm of public scholarship. Through TEDx talks, Instagram, YouTube, international conference lectures, published academic works, and programmatic initiatives, she has emerged as a catalyst for change, championing racial literacy and inclusive leadership. Boasting over 20 years of experience, her scholarly pursuits and advocacy work have garnered a discerning global perspective on educational research and diversity. Thank you so much for being here in support of this community, Dr. Keisha and Atra. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Keisha.
Thank you, Emma. We have started each and every book club in this series with a moment of silence. And today will be no different. We are going to give a moment of silence to cover several aspects of trauma and survival and resilience. First of all, we want to give a moment of silence to acknowledge the Titanic submersible submarine and the 5 lives we now understand were lost at sea. But in the same breath, we also want to acknowledge any other lives that have been lost at sea, both nationally and regionally. When I say that, I think of the countless lives that are lost in sea as people are migrating from one place to the other. So we also want to include that. Lastly, we want to include a moment of silence to the survivors of mass shootings and gun violence. As it was noted by one of our panelists that you'll hear from today, this is also another area in the sense of the ripple effect of violence. So we want to acknowledge the struggle, the resilience, the pain, the experience of individuals who survive gun violence. Please join me in this moment of silence. Thank you so much. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my amazing co-moderator. Please join me and let's begin this conversation in earnest.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Keisha. Today we will discuss chapters 19 through 39 of Becoming Ms. Burton, From Prison to Recovery to Leading the Fight for Incarcerated Women by Susan Burton and Cari Lynn. This third section of the book covers the theme of recovery, re-entry, and a new way of life. And we'll pick it up with question 1 in just a second. So this book has been transformational for me, and I'm sure many of you readers out there and our panelists. So understand that we care about you, and we understand that self-care is important for you and for us. So at any time, we welcome you to take a pause. We would like you to breathe and relax into the present moment to help you stay grounded, centered, and anchored in our discussion with each other. So if we can, we'll go ahead and start with question 1. Throughout her life, Susan is made to feel singularly responsible for her problem. Her aunt calls her a dirty little girl when she discovers that her boyfriend is abusing Susan. Her mother calls her a bad seed and says she is rotten to the core. What other messages of blame do Susan and others who become caught up in the criminal justice system hear from family, friends, community, and society as a whole? And have you ever been affected by negative messages about you or your life? So we'll open this up to the panel and take your responses and start this discussion. David, I see your hand first. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Atra.
Yeah.
You know, for me, when I read the early section of this book, being a sexual abuse, physical abuse survivor myself, my heart just cried for Susan and all of the other victims in our world. It truly did. And then when I further read what her aunt did after she found out that she had been sexually abused by her boyfriend, it just resonated with me how people are literally forced or trapped into labeling, stigma, toxic guilt, and painful shame that is not theirs to carry in any way, shape, or form. And as I continue to read through this amazing book, I am further touched by the stigma that people that have been imprisoned, labeled a felon, have brain diseases such as alcoholism, substance addiction, or other mental health diseases, and how that locks them in and exorcises them not only from their true self, but from their families of origin and from society. We have so much that needs to be changed, so much that needs to be redefined for individuals and groups. And this book does a masterful job of describing the struggles that these populations have, because most of these populations have multiple labels laid upon them, not just one, but multiple. And then we have the power of poverty and the power of what I call social entrapment, being left in a ghetto, left being into paralyzing poverty. We have so much we need to advocate for and change. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that response. As you were talking, I was looking at the question again about what other messages of blame do Susan and others who become caught up in the criminal justice system, and the part that says caught up in the criminal justice system, hear from family, friends, community, and society as a whole. And I was reminded of when they went to advocate, when Josh, the first attorney that she had hired, went to advocate for their records, right? Their expunged records still showing up in the system when they shouldn't have, and how they were getting away with that. And that, they've gotten the record expunged and they're still going to apply for a job so that they can pay for things and start their life over. That sidetracks me and reminds me of the woman who had to pay back child support, and then 25% of her back child support was taken out. And it's like that caught up part is what stuck out to me in this question, because you're still being told, even though you've done everything that you need to do, you're still being told you're to blame. It's your fault. You should be ashamed of yourself. And by the way, you don't matter, because if you did, something that should have been done for you wouldn't be an issue, and you'd be able to sort of go through the system. Even Susan herself had to constantly get clearance for programs that she was a part of. And it's like over and over and over again, being told you're to blame, you should be ashamed of yourself, just by those, I don't even consider them microaggressions, those macroaggressions that were happening against them every single time they turned around. So thanks. Julia, I see your hand.
I have to unmute. I love that you brought that up, Atra. I tagged a quote on this question from page 46, where it almost is like when Susan is speaking to folks that she's meeting, it's like her own version of the ACEs questionnaire. But she starts out by saying, many of our women had post-incarceration syndrome. I'd experienced myself. I'd been so conditioned to feel shame and to believe I was a bad person who didn't deserve a better life. For a long, long time, I believed I was insignificant. And she goes on to discuss with folks that it wasn't just about landing in prison. It was the long road that led them there. Like, did you ever feel safe? Did you have adequate shelter? Did you have enough food? Did you have a sense of security? And she just says that rarely did you hear anyone answer yes. And then the follow-up question that just really touched me was when she would ask them, what happened to shape you, to compel you to make the decisions you did, to make you feel powerless, to make you feel desperate, and to make you feel hopeless. And there's so many of these messages that that come out to blame folks that have survived and been caught up in this system. But that really just felt like it summed it up for me, that feeling of like desperation and powerlessness that is just perpetuated before they're incarcerated, while they're incarcerated, in every step of the way of reentry.
I'm reminded of what when the conversation that he had with Susan about how when he got addicted to meth, dropped out of UCLA, and he realized he had support, he had resources, he had a family, he didn't have to worry about a roof over his head and food to eat. And one of the reasons that compelled him to stay was because he realized other people don't have that. And other people don't have those resources that are available, like that were available to him. And all these questions are aligned with that, right? When she said to a drug treatment program, right? All of these things. And then she says at the bottom of that page, which I completely highlighted the whole page, and that now you can be the designer of your own destiny. You can create your own community of support and love and hope. And I just love that that's what they're doing at A New Way of Life. That's what Antoinette and her mom are doing. It's just amazing. Thanks, Julia. Michelle, I see your hand. Hi, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you all. It's an honor for me. I agree, but to a point, they were able to create their destiny, right? Because, and I might be jumping ahead, but on page 229, when those AB 109 funds came out and the LAPD wanted to get some of that funding, and so they created those, well, I read it as a raid. I didn't read it as they were coming and doing a review of services and of change, but to me, it was a raid and intrusion of these women's lives. And like Susan in here, is a re-traumatization for them. And so to me, it looked like these women were fighting for security and trying to create a safe life for themselves for the first time and for their children. And then the greed and power of organizations came in and didn't think twice about what the hard work these women put in to get to where they were. Even though they were micro steps to us, they were major steps for these women to secure a job and to stay clean, and then to be re-traumatized and have those messages and those labels come flooding back. It was just, and it angered me, and my stomach like just turned when I read that page.
Yeah. It just seems to be a theme in this book, right? With you're about to get some money. Let me come up in here and side along with you and not do any of the work, but just sort of snatch that money out your hand, right? So, and raid's a good word to use about that, to describe that. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Antoinette, I see your hand. Come on. Are you there? Oh no. Did it drop? The internet dropped, I think. All right, we'll get back to her when she comes back. Okay, well, we'll go. Oh, there she is. Hey, Tony.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, welcome.
We've lost power.
Oh my goodness.
I'm on my cell phone. Can you see me okay?
We can. We can see and hear you beautifully. Thank you for being here with us.
Okay. I didn't get to finish hearing the other young lady, but if it's my turn to talk, for me, um, David made a point of talking about it's not just one thing. For me, it's layers. There's layers of oppression, and I call them systemic oppressions because for me, there was a systematic way of dealing with my mom, going through the processes, but not understanding what she'd had gone through, what she'd been through to get her to that point. As a child coming after her, I only could see what was the product at that particular time. And it was society that told me that my mother was, wasted and wasn't going to change, and gave me no opportunity to really have that faith in her to get it together, to do the things that she needed to do. And I think what was powerful for me was
Oh, what was powerful for me was, and then right then, oh, yes, we will hopefully hear the completion of that, and get Tony back on the line with us. So, oh, Tony, are you back by chance? Yeah, looks like we're having some technical problems with that. And we'll go over to you, Angelique. I see your hand, and then we'll get Tony back on.
This really reminded me of something we went over in a social psych class where we looked at individualistic cultures and societies looking at personal attributions for why things happen the way they do. Whereas with collective societies and collective cultures, it's often looked at more situationally. And again, this is one of those times where everything that happens to the person is blamed on them, whereas the kind of systemic aspect of it is completely ignored. It reminded me of something I read recently of the homeless community and the perception being, oh, why don't they just get a job? But when they go to do applications and actually accept offers, they have to register a living address in order to accept that and in order to be registered in the company's system. But they can't afford a house because they don't have a job, but they don't have a job. It's one of those things.
Yeah.
It's just something that just keeps going around and around.
Yeah, it's that cycle, right? That cycle that keeps going. Thank you, Angelique. Tony, we see that you're back. You left us on this cliffhanger. Can you hear us? Oh, might still be an issue. All right, we'll keep waiting to see if she can chime back in. We'll go ahead and move on to question number 2. And then Dr. Keisha, if Tony can jump back in, I'll let you pick it up from there.
No problem. I'm eagerly awaiting what
happened
after that. Feels like one of those old school TV series where the car is on the cliff and you're like, join us next week.
Next episode. Yeah.
But question 2 asks, thinking of examples from the book, how do these messages, which blame the victim, affect the people receiving them? How does victim blaming prevent healing and the possibility of rebuilding one's life? Are there ways to address or challenge someone who is victim blaming? This is a wonderful question because we definitely see so many examples. To use Susan's language, how she would deliberately go to meetings and be a thorn in their side, or, say the hard things or say the uncomfortable things that would push back against the comfortable assumptions of victim blaming. So I can't wait to hear from our panelists and how you want to approach this question or how you want to start the conversation around this question. David, please.
Just briefly, because I'd really love to hear from the other panelists, two things that resonate for me throughout this book is the war on drugs, which I've always had an issue with. I think addiction is the only disease that our country has waged a war against. And I think, again, to be Captain Obvious, it is those that are marginalized population, those that live in poverty and have very little means that have been the victim of this war on drugs. And then the other thing that resonates with me is the absolute capitalism that drives the Department of Corrections in most states of the United States. Without any vocational or rehabilitation, true vocational or true rehabilitation direction. Thank you.
No, David, thank you. A few of the things you said immediately took me back to the book in terms of the war on drugs. When I think about the question, the sense of who it affects, I was so proud of Susan's unwavering honesty when she included how immigration has also been the subtle, silent war that was attached to the war on drugs, how it was once again used to push out members of our society that we feel are expendable. And secondly, I also appreciated how she brought in Angela Davis's work around the prison industrial complex and then highlighted again the silent children's industrial complex. So it's the marriage of these diabolical systems that not only profit, because the prison industrial complex is its own well-oiled machine for capitalism, and then the separating of the families and getting money and all of the things that come from the offspring, the children, and how they are then impacted. So really appreciate your commentary. Thank you for starting the discussion on question 2. I can't wait to see who comes in next and adds to this discussion further. James, hey. Oh, you're muted, sir.
Good afternoon, Doctor. Just wanted to make a quick assessment about the way it affects persons that these words are being said to. The statements cause the mind to go into conflict with the right and the wrongs, and also automatically places the person in isolation and fear to use their voice or ask for help. Thank you.
Mic drop. Thank you for sharing that. Was that a page from the book? If you'd be so kind as to share what page that was.
That was a page from Gordon Notes.
Not a problem. All respected. Thank you for that.
When they're attacked with something like that, you automatically know you're isolated, and it tells you, don't come to me with it. Don't go to anybody else. You just deal with it. And your mind is going to remain in a state of conflict, because where you thought you had covering, you know you don't now. And when you know you were right, you're being accused of being wrong. So that sets up insecurities, isolation, conflict of the mental state of mind, and further breaks down a person in an already desolate situation.
When you say that, I think about the conversation we had last week and the conversation after the conversation. And you also mentioned this last week in the book club, the profound statement about possibilities, knowledge. And I always misquote you on this, but it was one of my favorite things that you said so far. Would you be so kind as to say that again? Because
Yes, ma'am. Knowledge brings hope. Hope brings possibilities, and possibilities invoke change.
And when I hear that in context of what we're looking at in terms of this question, this whole idea of victim blaming is how a wall, a firm wall, seems to be put in between the other aspects of the change that can occur. So thank you for sharing that and for getting us to even understand how impactful. And thank you, Emma, for putting it in the chat. Knowledge brings hope. Hope brings possibilities. Possibilities invoke change. And in the idea of consistently blaming the victim, you rob them of the knowledge, which Susan is so beautiful in pointing out how she consistently, as she becomes more active in community meetings, in policy, she starts to see that so many of the things she blamed herself for not doing, for not overcoming, she starts to see all of the invisible forces that was pushing her towards prison, pushing her back into these aspects of being dependent on a system that is designed to be oppressive. And so that knowledge was the differential factor in how she moved forward. Because when she didn't have that knowledge, she blamed herself and stayed consistent in that cycle. But as we saw her move forward in her advocacy and her policy change, that's something she worked so diligently to make sure people understood. Okay, I got to get off my soapbox. Thank you so much, James. Would love to hear from, oh, hey, Dean. Please join the conversation.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. This is a great conversation. And one of the things that I think that impresses me about victim blaming is that it doesn't take into account the context for decision making. When Ms. Burton introduces us to Flozell in that chapter, one of the things she says about her is that, and about all of us who are in those situations, right, is that people fail to understand what it means to make decisions when the options are limited, right? So that when in my field in Christian ethics, we call it the circumscription of moral agency, right? Big words, you know. But basically it is, we always have the right to choose, but your choices are limited. And so to blame people for making bad decisions when most of the options are bad ignores the context. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. And the other is that one of the things that helps people, it says change ways to address someone who's victim blaming. One of the things that I've experienced is that victim blaming is challenged by proximity. In other words, when the victim is someone close to me, very often it begins to change my perspective. So that, you know, I happen to be a pastor. And one of the things that I've seen over the years is pastors who ask their women in the church who are being beaten and abused, like Ms. Burton was, well, what did you do to, you know, make him angry, right? Until it's their daughter. Then the tide changes and the proximity changes their perspective. And so one of the things that I think this book helps us do is it brings a sense of proximity of persons who are making decisions with limited options, persons who are facing all of these levels or layers, as Tony put it, of oppression, and humanizing it in such a way that we have to begin to question our own victim blaming because it's now proximate. And in my experience in working with people in more affluent communities and seemingly disinterested communities when the stuff begins to happen to them, right? It's like a last thing. It's like the war on drugs. The war on drugs was victim blaming, and I say this as a recovering addict. It was victim blaming until the drugs got into suburban wealthy communities, and now all of a sudden it's the opioid crisis.
Right.
You know, right now we have a health crisis, the opioid crisis.
Not a war, a crisis. Yes, sir.
Yeah, not a war, right?
Uh-huh.
But what changed? What changed the game? Proximity.
Right.
Proximity is a game changer.
So, YouTube community, y'all not gonna believe this, but this is Dean's first time on the book club, and I think you said your second book club conversation ever. And I feel like you took to this like a fish to water. So happy to have you here, and I hope you continue to contribute because your perspectives are so valuable. I just want to support what you said and support what James said with two passages from the book that are actually complementary. So page 164, for those of you reading the book, this perfectly backs up what you just said, Dean. Truth was, your decisions hardly mattered if none of your options were any good to begin with, right? And then for James, his quote around knowledge brings hope, it took me to page 165. When Susan breaks down how you build community power. There's a science to building community power. You build a base with outreach and recruitment. Then you sustain that base by developing leadership skills from within. Knowledge, building the base, hope, the process of building, and then the possibilities. That's in the teaching of the skills. So dynamic responses. Thank you so much, Dean. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, David. The floor is open. Would love to hear from anyone else and appreciate the honesty. Oh man, YouTube audience, get ready because here comes Keith.
Hello, everyone. And honestly, Dean started down the road of some of the comments I wanted to make. The concept of choices, what's the purpose of a choice when all the options are bad? I think the frustration I have with it is not only are all the options bad, but part of the information is being withheld. Kind of like the way Susan only accidentally found out about the options she had in terms of the civil options, rather than just facing another incarceration. So there's this. The problem with the system is it doesn't just present bad choices, it actively hides selectively the good choices. Because we have this nasty habit. We want to be tough on crime in America, but we don't want to be tough on the root causes of crime that have already been identified via research and known for decades. We just want to hold the individual accountable for the choices that they made in that moment, but none of the circumstances that led up to it. And Dean pointed out a good thing in terms of the difference in how, and I hear this a lot when we're talking about substance abuse and recovery, we tried to incarcerate our way out of the crack epidemic, but now we want to treat our way out of the opioid epidemic. And it's the issue of race factors in so strongly because it wasn't just about the complexion of the people who were struggling with drug addiction. When the dealers looked like Freeway Rick, it was a problem. But when the dealers looked like white physicians, well, magically nobody got consequenced. I mean, the criminal justice system doesn't just blame the victim. It tries to reframe the narrative to make sure that the perpetrators don't look like mainstream America, even when they do. And the victim always has to be brown or black. So it's just it's bad. The victim blaming isn't a side effect of the system. It's the designed intent of the system.
Yeah.
Tony, thank you so much. Glad you're back. Keith, always a pleasure. I am going to move forward, because if I comment on what you said, I know I'm going to rob somebody of commenting as we get further down the road with these questions. So Tony, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And then Angie, if you'd be so kind, we will probably come to you for question 3 so we can keep moving the discussion. But yes, you are absolutely going to be heard from.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. It looks like the power's back on.
The power back on.
Yes, this is the desktop view.
I know, and apologize for the cliffhanger, but my conversation is always going to lead in a circle. And so going back to address a couple of things, when the gentleman talked about the complexion and the victim blaming, and going from victim blaming to addressing, trying to treat our way out of a situation. And so I talked in the past couple of weeks about how much pressure I was under with, my mother talking about doing the book, because a part of that exposes me and how I felt about that exposure and the negativity that was going to come my way. But as soon as I got over that hurdle and the book came out, and corporate America in my regime got a hold of the book, it was now time to invite me to the table. And probably just like my mother, I got to the table and I said, welcome, welcome, because what my mother was living and others were living, and those affected by all of that were living, was that victim blaming and that victim shaming. And the children who came after their parents were taught to victim blame and victim shame. And so I did the same thing, and it was her shame, and I didn't want it to be my shame. But all of a sudden, can your mom come and help? Can your mom do this? We're having this health crisis. And it was like, yeah, welcome, because now you understand how I feel. But I was afraid to give that information, or afraid to put that out there because of the being subjected to all of that. And so it just ties that back together. And just to go back just a little bit about the layers, I too, as a child coming behind my mother, became another layer of her suppression, because I was blaming her. Why can't you get it together? Why can't you do these things? And as I got a little older and began to understand just a little bit more, when she went into recovery, like I said last week, tell me why this place that I had rode my bicycle past on numerous occasions was literally a bicycle ride away, and it had never been offered to my mother. The only thing that had been offered to her was going back to prison. And it's again, having those choices, having choices being kept away from you, that perpetuates that cycle and continues to cycle down the line. And the epiphany for me was the first time that my mom came to me and actively asked for help. My first thought was no, because that's what the system and society had taught me to say. But after I thought about it and understood, this was really the first time she was asking me. So do I really want to keep doing the same things and expect different results? And maybe let me just listen to her and see if there's something I can do. Because if I didn't try to do something, was it still going to be the same thing? And that time she asked me and that time I accepted, my mother has never gone back through that again. And so it could just be that simple, or there could be some more layers to it. But just having that opportunity to be there sparked a whole new world for the both of us.
Tony, it is such an honor each and every time you join these discussions, because of the depth of your responses. And so I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to let that breathe. But I am going to read some of the YouTube comments from our YouTube community so they can be brought in to this discussion as well. So here we go. Doe shared great cliffhanger moment, drum roll. Leslie shared victim blaming reinforces toxic shame. And we have, I believe it's Diane. She shared, I coordinated through barbed wire for 13 years. Mrs. Burton's book reinforced lessons of those years. Zeph shared, thank you for the comments about capitalism and exploitative nature of, okay, big words, carceral systems. It's important to remember the US economic system requires a certain percentage of us to be unemployed. Come through, Zeph. And he has there's another comment as well. A part of my pronoun slip. I did not mean to label you. We are intentionally kept exploitable. And when we break from the pressure, we are locked into jails and prisons where corporations bleed more money out of the government, individuals, and families. Leslie shared, great points, Dean, exclamation point. Those are the comments from our YouTube community. Please keep them coming. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments as well. Question 3, Achara, I would love to hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Question 3 sort of piggybacks on what Tony was saying. So what are the challenges facing women of color upon re-entering society? And what are some of the ways that Susan and A New Way of Life tackle these challenges? And so, Tony, I see your hand up. So I'd just like to give you the floor again to offer an answer to this question.
And I apologize, I never took my hand down, but the first thought I had was, what aren't the challenges? And when you talk about a new way of life, how I explain this to someone is bringing a woman home and providing wraparound services to her for things that societal norms take for granted. Coming home after 33 years of prison and not having your birth certificate, not having your social security card, not even understanding how to work a phone, having a hot meal, things that we literally take for granted are the things that we're trying to tackle in the challenges of women coming home. We want all women who come into the program to be able to sit down and make a choice about their life. Do you have skill sets? Do you want to work? Have you thought about transferable skills and things that you've learned while you were away? Do you want, do you have children? Are you looking for visitation? We have a family reunification department that works to start visitation, works to get custody. We have homes where women and children live. We are actively working programs where we're trying to tap into different industries that are not stuck on, have you ever been convicted of a felony mantras. And so we're trying to uplift the women and help them reintegrate back into society, because I'm a firm believer. I've said it twice now. I was the never say never kid. Never will my mother get sober. Never will she ever be able to contribute to society. And I've been able to eat and munch on those words for the past 26 years to say never. If you're given that chance, as the gentleman pointed out, and given those opportunities, you can do those things. So if I understand from the depths that my mother has had to drag herself from, if she can do it, anyone can do it, but they need the proper tools in order to do that.
Thank you, Tony. When you were speaking earlier from the perspective of what it does to children and the reentry for the parents, I was reminded of, and I brought it up earlier just briefly, the story of Lisa James on page 253, where she came out and she regained custody of her boys, but was served by the county with a bill for back payment of child support for $32,000. And then they said, oh, and she was in for another surprise because her debt was in arrears. The total amount she owed ballooned to an unbelievable $40,000, 25% automatically going to the county. And there's a a line here right after that, and it says, she felt like she was being pushed underwater. And if any of us have ever been pushed underwater or maybe not regained ourselves, I live in Florida, so I'm at the beach a lot, and I know what that feels like, being taken under by that undertow and just you can't seem to get air. And that line hit me. And it says after that, a single mom providing for 3 sons was virtually impossible with a minimum wage job in the first place, let alone with a quarter taken off the top and no end to debt in sight. And then this goes back to what Dean was saying earlier and what many have said earlier. It says, she tried to seek help and went through the process of declaring hardship, at which point her monthly payments were adjusted to what the county called affordable. And that brings us back to affordable for who? For whom? Affordable for whom? And everything that you were saying, it just echoes that. Like, it's, the system is designed to not be in support of people. It doesn't take into account, there's a judgment made, but it doesn't take into account the holistic system of oppression that exists for people and persons of color trying to re-enter into society after being incarcerated. So thank you, Tony, for your comments and your shares. Dean, I see your hand, and then I see Dorian. So go with Dean.
Thank you. I'll be quick.
Yes.
Ms. Burton mentioned the fear of losing their children for as far as women are concerned. There's and that's absolutely true. And there's even laws like the termination of parental rights that some states employ that will take a child if the mother hasn't had X amount of contact with them. There's another dimension that's been discovered in some of the research that when a mother is locked up, the child's anger is greater than if the father is locked up. And so what we've been learning in studying these populations is that, you know, I went to prison. My kids were like, well, that's what happens with daddies. You know, daddies go to jail. Mommies aren't supposed to leave. And so the reconciliation process, even if you keep your children, is more difficult for women than it is for men because of the expectations of children, the bonding of children, how incarceration for some males has been glorified and is a form of street cred. And so we've seen a number of women who didn't lose their children physically, but who had virtually lost them emotionally. And the process of regaining the trust with that mother is very, very difficult. And I think Tony spoke to some of that in her own journey with us. The other thing that is, it's related. Men come home, they were in a relationship, next, right? Women come home, they were in a relationship, they have they have fewer options, so they go back to an old bad relationship that put them on the course to go to prison in the first place. And so they depend on that relationship in precisely because of the limited options that they're given upon reentry. And so we've created a culture of dependency amongst women on men who are the primary reasons they're there in the first place. When I'm talking to women in prison, somebody says, my daughter's in prison, I always ask, what's his name? Because there's always a he. 80-90% of the time, there's a he.
That's so powerful, what you just shared. I just want to let that land for a second, or as Dr. Keisha says, let it breathe. That is so powerful. We just spent a week, I just got back last week, and I want to bring up how they're, even with the people that are in the system, we just were helping an organization that helps to reunify families. And they were sharing with us that they only have a certain amount of time to meet a certain amount of meetings and criteria. And if they could just give these families a little bit more time with the parents, then they would not have to testify against these parents who they want to see reunified with their children, but they just don't have enough time. And it's, again, back to these systems of oppression, again, back to when we see the families go, well, but mommy's not allowed to go to prison, and the emotional abandonment and what that does to a child's psychological abandonment, and how the system co-ops children into sort of being perpetuators of this victim blaming and victim shaming. Thank you, Dean. That was so deep. Dorian, I see your hand next.
Yeah. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here again. And I want to be very clear, and I'm going to make it very short, that I am obviously not going to be speaking from my perspective on this issue, as I'm a white male, cis male. And I just want to put out there that our culture is inherently white supremacist and inherently patriarchal. And so women of color who are re-entering society are not only entering a culture that actively targets them due to their skin color, but also actively pushes them down due to the gender that they present themselves as. And I've seen it way too many times. I used to work. One of my jobs was at the women's infirmary at Rikers Island in the Rosie's facility, and the amount of pregnant women that were in there who were individuals that I was working with or doing group sessions with, oftentimes they were born into foster care, had zero support just from that structure, and their children are being taken away the moment that they're born and put into foster programs. And there are instances where the women are able to get their children back, but it is so rare. It's just absolutely unreal. I'll give just one last point, but even somebody like Mama Glow, if y'all are familiar with her story, but she was just released from Louisiana, one of the prisons in Louisiana. She was the longest serving female prisoner. And she served 51 years for felony murder. She's in her late 70s, and she has now lost not one, not two, but 3 jobs just because of her second Social Security number that she has to put down. And I was at a presentation with her and her sister where they were speaking about this. She was on her 3rd day of training when the security guards came in to take her out from the 3rd job that she had applied for. And it was not only a societal just shame onto this woman, but they also spoke about how she is lucky because she has living family who is able to help support. And that's not the case with so many people. And it's a horror movie. It's a horror movie, and we have a lot of work to get through to make a dent. And it just creates a ripple effect, and it destroys lives. So I wanted to say that.
Thank you. And to mention that women giving birth in prison would be shackled as they did that as well. Not to mention that. So being traumatized throughout the pregnancy, the baby, and what we know from my grandmother's hands and intergenerational trauma, we're talking 3 generations and on, right, of traumatization for bringing these children into the world and what the effect has on women. Thank you, Dorian, for what you're sharing. Angelique, I see your hand, and then we'll move on. Maybe see some YouTube comments or go to the next question. Angelique?
I feel like that answer is kind of just the book in itself, where it looks at the entire everything from, actually written this down. It starts with, it looks at where it began, with childhood trauma and ACEs and generational trauma, it looks at where things went with addiction and things like that, but also looking at things like AA, recovery, making amends. They then look at where things are in that moment, where they are providing housing, food, transportation for those first few months when women get out. And then they're also looking to where it's going. So these women are in classes, they're getting jobs, they're building up a foundation that sustains them for the life that they want to live. And that, for me, that kind of holistic overview, getting everything in line part, is where Susan's success comes from. Because it's not just looking at one of those things in isolation, because you can't separate them. They are distinct in themselves, but they cannot be separated. And she recognizes that and she respects that and just absolutely goes with it.
Yeah, that reminds me of the points that were being made by panelists earlier about the layers, right? It's not just one thing in isolation. It's this very complex system and hoop jumping and constant obstacles that they have to face. It's devastating, right? Re-traumatizing, devastating. And then to be told, oh, you should be grateful, right? Oh, you should be thankful that you even have family alive, or you should be this. And it's, again, victim blaming and shaming with toxic gratitude. It's just constant.
It's also like it's making someone lesser than you because you're telling them what they should be doing. Looking at humans having that innate autonomy, self-determination, all of those different things. There are very few circumstances in which you can tell someone who they are and how they should feel. And this feels exactly like that. It's an imposition. It is, you are lesser than me, and therefore I can tell you how you should be feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Angelique. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to question 4. Dr. Keisha, I'll pass that over to you.
Thank you. After reading The New Jim Crow, which is a phenomenal book, if anyone has not engaged in this, it is the perfect companion book to this book. And other books, and talking to new friends in the criminal justice reform movement, Susan came to understand the larger political and societal forces that affected her and her family. She began to believe that the criminal justice system, as well as other social systems and power structures, are designed to disadvantage and oppress poor people of color. What does she mean by that? How did the criminal justice system become this way? Do you agree or disagree with her beliefs about how these systems can harm people rather than help people? Have you been part of social systems that diminished you as an individual? Keith, please start us off with this question.
Yeah. In 1974, there was a researcher named Martinson who had a piece that was called Nothing Works. Mm. What it basically looked at was rehabilitation programs as they existed in American penal system at that time. And it came to the research-based suggestion that none of those programs worked very well. Except for this one category called cognitive behavioral stuff, which was still in its infancy in the 70s, but it became the mantra of conservative America as a recreation of the criminal justice system from a focus on rehabilitation to just incarcerating and warehousing. The gentleman, Martinson, who did this study, spent the next 5 years trying to get the politicians who went on this massive expansion of the criminal of the prison system across most states in America. He spent 5 years desperately trying to get them to understand that was not what his work was intended to suggest. It was to focus on developing new programming for rehabilitation. It actually worked. Finally, after 5 years of sitting in horror and watching this system that resulted from his research, the man killed himself. That got dovetailed with the war on drugs, which we went into knowing that Rand Corporation studies told us the only predictable outcome of the intervention strategy of incarceration that we pursued was that it would have no impact on rates of addiction at all, but it would result in a disproportionate amount of incarceration of urban males. So some of the stats, when Susan talks about things like how many Black women are using substances, but how many of them are incarcerated, it isn't just that this system has an unfortunate consequence of oppressing people. That's its design. From things like the research that got us here either being ignored, or the reality of things like people, while you're in prison, you count as a part of the population for where you're housed for census information. So rural communities get all the benefits of having primarily African-American inmates at the same time that those folks don't get any voting power while they're locked up. And to show the level of insanity we've gotten to this, we still have states limiting the voting rights of felons while we got a man trying to run for president, and nobody kind of looked at the fine print and realized a felony conviction won't even keep this individual from running for president, but it'll damn sure keep some folks from voting for him or against him. So I think we're so far past the point of a debate about whether or not the system is broken. And then we need to be having honest conversations about what is it actually intended to do, because it hasn't been about rehabilitation, which I think the average layperson still thinks the criminal justice system is about. It is an intentionally harmful system. It is an intentionally discriminating system. And when I was doing my graduate studies in criminal justice at the #1 school of criminal justice research in America, the slogan was, you got to be comfortable with blood on your boots if you're working in this environment. My problem was the blood was pouring out of people who looked just like me. So it's a broken system. It's functioning in a maladaptive, maleficent way at best. So this question hits close to home for me.
As it should, because the point of this discussion is to make sure it is an honest one and a relevant one. So thank you for bringing your whole self to the response. Michelle and then David.
Well, I, as a white woman in Texas that votes Democrat, I was shocked in the book to see how my party played a huge role in removing support for those that needed food stamps, and seeing how the bill was written under the Clinton administration to look and appease the conservative group, actually, and didn't take into context the people that it was actually supposed to serve. And as a child, being raised in a Republican home, I was one of the children standing on the White House lawn with Nancy Reagan with my T-shirt that said, "Just say no to drugs." And I just about fell off the couch when I read that page and a half about the Reagan administration and how they glossed over what their true purpose was in their campaign on the war on drugs. This opened my eyes, and it has helped me see that I can't necessarily stay true to a party. I have to do, as an educated individual, I have to do my own due diligence and educate myself on what individuals are standing for, what bills are being written in my state. And I have to, as a citizen, and the ability, stand up for those that currently don't have a voice and fight for it, no matter if it's coming from conservative or from the liberal. As I think it's Brene Brown that says, you have to stand in the wilderness. So we have to have our belief system of doing what's right for others, not doing what's Democrat or Republican, but doing what's right for other people, for mankind and humanity, for our neighbors. It just blew my mind completely, this book, in that way.
Thank you, Michelle, for your honesty and the journey that you had the courage to honestly engage in, critically, assess. I'm always fascinated when people have to have those very hard conversations about the way in which they were raised, understanding that the people who loved them were also directly engaged in the mind washing or in the furthering of the lie.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I appreciate your transparency as you begin to realize what you were really, brought into and pictures you were asked to pose for, right? Understanding the depth of what that meant. And Susan's book was unflinching in the retelling of Rick Ross, the way in which, how she said one day crack wasn't there, then the next day it was, and how it just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. That suddenly is all of some of what you're saying and some of what we've heard from other panelists. So thank you. David.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keisha. I first of all want to put a huge exclamation mark on Keith and Michelle's comments, because what that brings up for me is the victimization we have all experienced in the United States. And the word that keeps coming back to me that we've used the last several weeks is the power of layering. I mean, I look at the lack of ethics on our Supreme Court right now. I look at the power of lobbying groups in the United States on our supposed political system, and the absolute power of discrimination and capitalism that is rampant in our world. And what I read in Susan's book is she accidentally stumbled into rehabilitation. Accidentally.
Absolutely.
After decades of incarceration. And when she opened that women's center in that home is when I believe the spiritual light truly came on for Susan, and she saw the belly of the beast, plural, that had kept her and other women of minority trapped for her entire life. What a powerful statement. And to me, as a person in recovery from PTSD and addiction, grew up until I was 8 years old in abject poverty and abuse, it shone a light on how in our world we continue to victimize the innocents of the world. So tragic, so sad. but so much hope in her work. Thank you.
Thank you, David. With the time we have left, I really want to hear from our panelists because we have so many brilliant minds that I am going to resist the urge to say anything because I want to squeeze as much time out of these final 10 to 14 minutes. Dorian, please.
Yeah. Oh man, just the entire experience of reading the new Jim Crow, it was such an eye-opener for just understanding how the specifically the Black community, but really how people of color are targeted. One thing that I always try to emphasize, and this is not any way of expressing a like, hey, we've all gone through bad times kind of argument, is more of a I understand how effed up the entire situation is for different communities. But one thing I try to emphasize is that if I was from a different neighborhood with a different skin color, absolutely would have been incarcerated at this point in time, because a lot of the individuals that we do meet who are incarcerated, their first offense is oftentimes something that most young people are involved with. But the point is that I'll just give an example. A very close friend of mine stole a PlayStation out of another person's house. They knew the door was unlocked, went in, took it. His mom was a lawyer and his dad is a pastor. And so he was able to get basically it lowered down to community service hours, and he never did anything like that again. If he was a different skin color, those resources would not have been there. The system would have actively been targeting his neighborhood 4 or 5 times more police presence, all of these sorts of elements. And as well as just the poverty line of not having access to a lawyer mother or a leader of a church in a small community as your father. And you just have all of those elements, and it's really not until the 4th or 5th time through that people really get into the much more destructive behavior. And it's just it's absolutely disgusting, because it is our system is structured to weaponize normal human behavior, especially in youth, but specifically to target people of color. And in the case of Susan's story, women of color who have to be more quiet in their rage because the system is even more disrespectful. And I know I'm speaking broadly and generally, and I don't want to put words into anybody's personal experience, but just as a step back social analysis, this has just been the story of America. So
Thank you, Dorian. I wrote down your statement around being quiet in their rage. I've actually taken down a couple of statements from this conversation that I cannot wait to unpack in the conversation after the conversation, because we are definitely touching on some profound points that need room to fully be expressed. Tony, I see your hand up. Would love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I wrote a couple of things down as I was speaking, as he was speaking, excuse me. For me, the system is not broken. You know, it's by design, and it's doing exactly what was intended to do. We consider the system broken because it's per se not working for us. But to me, it's not broken. It's by design. The capitalism, just in looking at California, and it seems like I've said this 10 times in the past 3 weeks about California having 33 prisons, but 66% of those prisons were built after 1980. 1980, California had 11 prisons. And since then, California has only built one university, UC Merced, but it's built 22 prisons. And we are spending today, my guesstimation, in upwards of $85,000 to $90,000 per inmate. But if we were to turn that money into a salary for those inmates, what would recidivism look like? I really think that it's by design. And I think that for me, the divide and conquer mantra that society puts into place has built the layers that have gone on in my mom's life, my family's life of, cast away and throw away those who don't subscribe to societal norms, whether they can or not. And the last thing that I wanted to say is, at a book reading, I talked about being fed this diet of crap, so for me, it's no longer about ingesting or eating what society is feeding me. It's about creating my own diet. I'm no longer subscribing to society telling me that my mom is a castaway. She can't do this. She can't do that. Changing the narrative and changing my diet, because the diet that we are being fed is poisoning all of us. Mm-hmm. So that's it for me.
I'm going to read a quote from the book that made me think about what you shared, Tony. This is page 206 to 207, and this is Saul. It was as if I was, let me start with the full thing. Saul began organizing campus panels on structural racism and speaking about the legal needs of people who'd been behind bars. But the response outside of the critical race studies program shocked him. It was as if I was talking about things you don't mention in polite company, he described, which made him all the more convinced we really needed to be talking about such things. And that is exactly the power of this book discussion, the power of books like this, and hopefully the power of future podcasts and initiatives that are going to not only touch on individual experiences of the women, but begin to highlight the children's experiences. And so as we continue to talk about the things that we aren't expected to say in polite company, as we continue to kick down the lie of what gets to qualify as polite and what gets to qualify as rude, these conversations are important. And so again, in 30 minutes, I will have the conversation after the conversation, and I'll throw that information out there on YouTube. But panelists, I invite you to join me there so we can continue to engage in this. And thank you so much for what you've already said. We have about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. If anyone would like to have the final words on this conversation before I hand it back over to Emma. Dean, I really enjoy your voice. I really enjoy your wisdom. Being that this was your first time on this book club, would you mind leaving us with some of your final thoughts before we turn it over to our organizers? Anything you want to say, because you have lived experience on so many aspects of what we're talking about. I could think of no better way to end the conversation for this week.
Well, you're kind. Thank you, Dr. Keisha. This was a hard book to read because it brought up a lot of experiences, struggling with addiction, in and out of jail. I was one of those blessed people that had support. I had a church that supported me. I wasn't the pastor, but I had a church that supported me. And what I see in this book is that what she's done is she has discovered personally a lot of the things that research has revealed to be true. Changing a mindset, developing a supportive community, making the move. And a lot of people don't recognize this. I love the way that she starts by providing services and then moves from there to advocacy and systems change. The only way to have sustained systems change is if you care about the people who are hurt by the system, right? One of the things that all community organizers will tell you is that unless the community owns the issue because of proximity, you can't sustain it. Unfortunately, people don't do social justice because it's right. They do it because of their proximal status. The civil rights movement was a perfect example. Rosa Parks was somebody people knew. They rallied around Rosa Parks. Bus segregation had been wrong for decades, but they rallied around Rosa Parks. And when we have stories like Susan Burton's and others, we can both rally around their story, but then also identify the stories that are close to us and rally around them, because everybody knows somebody who's been through this situation, who's been through this circumstance. And I guess the last thing is, and then she models, and I think I said this, but I wanted to leave with this. She models that, what I call the on-ramp from serving those in need to advocating those in need. The second is not sustainable without the first.
And with that, I hand it over to Emma because there's nothing else that needs to be said. Thank you so much, Dean.
Wow. Okay. Like Dr. Keisha says, I feel like we need a minute to let that breathe, as Atra says, to let that discussion land. Such an important conversation to have, with kind of vibrant discussion that we've had today from our absolutely phenomenal panelists. And thank you for tuning in tonight to join us for this discussion. And thank you to our virtual audience for your commentary. Let's see, we are on top of, today's conversation. We are delighted to offer you a new resource, the digital care package, as another complement to the book club experience. So inside you can find resources to help manage any feelings of grief, sadness, or overwhelm that may arise as a result of reading about and discussing the sensitive topics covered in Becoming Miss Burton. And I think tonight is a good example of some of those topics that are so important to talk about, but so painful to hear, right? So as well as additional resources provided by our incredible moderators. So everyone who has registered for book club will receive an email with next week's YouTube link before the next session. So you should receive it tomorrow, and a link to the digital care package. You can also find that information when you log in to your TRF members account. Finally, I'm so excited to tell all of you this. Dr. Keisha and Achara will be hosting a conversation after the conversation, as Dr. Keisha would say it, to continue this vibrant and important discussion. They welcome you to join them on StreamYard, and you are welcome to watch and participate by clicking the link in the YouTube chat in 30 minutes or 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We'd love to hear about your experience. Please feel free to reach out and share any feedback with us by emailing us at programs@traumaresearchfoundation.org. Also, again, I want to reiterate that next week, Susan Burton herself will be joining us for a live question and answer session. We'll be taking questions not only from our panelists who are participating, but from our YouTube audience. And you will hear from the author, the visionary, the luminary, the advocate herself, Susan Burton. So I'm so excited for that discussion, and I hope you will join us next week, the same time.